There's no going back.
Welcome to day 5. Today I'm going to be talking about fat over lean and what does it actually mean. Now, this was probably one of the most embarrassing moments that I've ever had as an artist, was misunderstanding fat over lean. And I do think there's a lot of artists, I don't think I'm the only one that totally misunderstood it. So I'm going to explain it to you in a lot less technical terms than what you might find elsewhere. It's actually a really easy concept to grasp. And when you do get it, you kind of, like I did, feel a bit embarrassed of having it gotten wrong in the first place. Okay, now, first thing I want you to understand is that lean, we're talking about terps, and fat, we're talking about oil, okay? There in the middle is your paint right out of the tube. Okay. So if you think of your paint coming, so now we're talking oil paint, so if you think of your paint coming out of the tube as being neutral, it's neither fat nor lean, it's just neutral. Technically speaking, it is slightly fat because the carrier that carries your pigment will either be linseed oil or alkyd or something, so there will be a bit of oil in it. But for purposes of understanding it, let's talk about the oil straight out of the tube as being lean, neither lean nor fat, it's neutral. Now if you add terps to that, you're going to be making it more lean. Okay. In other words, you're reducing the fat content. If you're going to add oil to it, you're going to be making it more fat, because you're increasing the fat content. Now, why is this important? When you're doing oil painting, 9 times out of 10, unless you're painting alla prima, you're going to be painting various layers of paint. Your first one will be your imprimatura layer, and which will usually just be coloring the canvas in some form with a wash of color, or even opposite colors, doing a very loose version of your final painting. But the fact is, you're going to be putting down a very thin base layer of color. The reason you put down an imprimatura layer is to break the white of the canvas and to establish an undertone, a temperature undertone for the painting that is to come. Artists, and it was the way that I was taught, is you add terps until it's very liquid, and then you paint your imprimatura layer with this very washy version of paint, and that is perfectly correct. The only thing that I would like to add to that is that it probably is a good idea to add a small amount of oil to that. Not enough to make it oily, but just enough to add binder. And the reason for that is that your paint is actually pigment in a carrier oil. The carrier oil is what actually binds your pigment to the canvas. And if you put enough terps into that and dilute it enough, you're going to have a chemical reaction that breaks the binding properties of your paint. And you could almost reduce your paint back down to powder. And certainly if it does bind to your canvas, it might not bind terribly well. In other words, if you run your finger over it after it's had a couple of days to dry, you might find some of the color rubbing off onto your finger. Whereas if you add a little bit of oil, you'll reduce that from happening. It just increases the binding properties of your imprimatura layer. Your next layer then will be more fat, less lean. Okay, so now let's just take right on the lean side of the scale. This is your very first layer. Okay, let's just say, give or take, you're going to put 90% terps, 10% oil. Now, I say give or take because I certainly don't expect you to measure 90% and 10%. It's just a gauge, all right? And then you have a various range of layers. Doesn't matter how many layers, it's totally up to you. You could paint in 1, 2, 3 or 10 layers. It really doesn't matter. But you've got to be aware of the fact that your amount of oil increases through the layers until eventually you're at maximum oil, minimum terps. What that is not important. It's literally just the fact that your oil versus terps ratio should be increasing as it goes up. So for example, you could then, your next layer could say be 75% terps and 25% oil. Now what I do is that I'll do my imprimatura layer like this. I'll do my dead layer, which would be, in my case, it would be a dead layer. I'll do my dead layer in the 75-25 mix. And then from there onwards, I'll stick to a 50-50. So 50% terps, 50% oil mix. And I'll use that mixture for all my layers going up. I don't necessarily, I'm not terribly pedantic about making sure that every layer is slightly more oil, slightly less terps. I just will paint the last few layers in the same 50-50 mix, and then when I come to my very last layer, then it'll just be 100% oil. Okay. If I do want it to be a little bit more liquid, because you can have just using oil can be a little bit stiff almost, you don't get the same sort of liquidity in your paint. But instead of using terps to make it more liquid, I will use, for example, linseed oil or safflower oil, because those are naturally more liquid. And I generally work with alkyd medium, generally. Unless I'm glazing, then I'll work with one of the other two oils. And sometimes I'll even go right up to my very last layer with the 50-50 mix. And the reason I do that is because my last layer will probably be an oiling out layer, which is just a plain blank oil layer. So it'll be oil straight out of the bottle, and usually liquid, straight out of the bottle and painted over the whole painting, which is what is considered oiling out, which is an alternative or a step prior to varnishing your painting. Those kinds of technical details we'll get to at a later stage. I will give you a demonstration of how to put down an imprimatur layer and how to oil out a painting, and I may even go as far as doing a varnish layer. Now, the reason I say I may is because I generally don't varnish, and that is just a personal preference. Varnishing is beautiful, and for the longevity of your painting, varnishing is stunning. But in this day and age, with the quality of the materials that we can buy, varnishing is not really a necessity, and oiling out your painting is good enough. But if you don't want to just be good enough, you want to be, really brilliant, then by all means go ahead and varnish. The advantages of varnish is the long-term longevity of your painting. At some stage in 100 or 200 years time, if somebody wants to restore your painting, they can simply take the layer of varnish off, because it's very easily removed, clean the painting, and then put the layer of varnish back on again without damaging the actual paint itself. That is not as easy to do with oiling out. Oiling out, you've actually got to wash the canvas, but if you oil out with liquid, or an alkyd resin, doesn't necessarily have to be Winsor & Newton's liquid, but if you oil out with an alkyd resin and you put a decent layer on it, then you're going to be able to quite easily wash your painting and get any surface dust that's stuck off. If you want a satin finish to your oiling, you can just do one layer. If you want a more glossy, you can do 2 layers. But that's a whole different lesson. The lesson that I wanted to go through today is specifically the fat over lean, the reducing your amount of terps as you go up and increasing the amount of oil as you go further up through your layers. Why is fat over lean important? Okay, it is very important. Oil paints dry not by evaporation but by oxidation. The particles of the oil and the molecular structure of the pigments actually bond together through absorption of oxygen. The more terps you've got in there, the more, because terps will dry through evaporation, okay, so the more terps you've got and the more evaporation you're going to have happening. The more oil you've got, the more oxidation you're going to have happening, and those two things happen at different rates. Evaporation happens a lot quicker than oxidation. Oxidation, in fact, never really stops. You'll have an enormous amount of oxidation happening in the first few days or weeks after you've finished your painting, but it continues to happen for months or even years to come. It slows down, but it does continue to happen. So your painting is constantly going through the oxidation process at a slower and slower rate, which is why if you're going to varnish your painting, you need to wait 6 months to a year at least before you varnish, because varnish will oxidate at a different rate to the oil that you've used in your paint, and you want them to dry at an equal rate. Which is why I oil out with the same oil that I've actually been painting with, so the oxidation happens at the same rate. The reason you want things to happen at the same rate, if your earlier layers dry quicker than your top layers, they're going to contract quicker than your top layers contract. So as these layers contract, these layers are going to buckle and crack. Over time, of course, it doesn't necessarily happen overnight, but in a year or 2 years or even in 10 years' time, you might notice fine hairline cracks. You might notice that at the edges of those hairline cracks your paint starts to curl up, and that is usually because of the fact that your oxidation processes are happening at a different rate from the bottom of the canvas, from the surface of the canvas through to the top layers of your painting. In the incorrect sequence, let's say, you might not notice the negative effects in 6 months or a year, but a little longer than that you might. I've got a painting standing in my gallery, in my studio, that I've had here for 3 years, painted incorrectly on purpose, and it's 3 years later, and on the surface I can't see anything yet, but if I hold it up to the light I can already see the hairline crack starting to form. And that was an experiment that I did, and it was to prove to myself more than anything else about how things can be done incorrectly and not be noticed for too long. One thing that you have to keep in mind is that the range of temperatures that your painting is subject to throughout its lifetime can also affect the cracking or the surface texture of your painting. And the reason for that has got little to do with how you've laid your layers down. And what it's got to do is with the extreme temperature changes. If a painting is subject to extreme temperature changes within 10 degrees over a short period of time, let's say for example if your painting is hanging in a place that has very hot days and very cold nights, so on a daily basis it's expanding and contracting, as most materials are subject to expanding and contracting. It's expanding and contracting at a large rate. At 10 degrees can cause quite a lot of expansion and contraction in your painting at a microscopic level that you won't even notice, but over time your painting can develop hairline cracks. So ways to look after your painting and ensure that its longevity is ensured is to keep your early layers lean, lots of turps, a little bit of oil, and increase your fat content as you're going up. You don't have to be scientific about it, you just have to be mindful of it. Oil out your paintings almost immediately after you've done them. If you want to varnish them, wait 6 months to a year at least, and get a good varnish and varnish it properly. We will go through the varnishing process at some point as well in these 365 days. And that the painting is stored for its lifetime to come in a place where the temperature differences is no more than 10 degrees between day and night or between seasons. I hope that helps. We're not going to be going too much more into the scientific or into the technical side of oil painting, although there will be areas where I will touch on it because I'm totally in love with the science of oil painting, and so you'll hear it come out of my mouth quite a lot. But I thank you for joining me on day 5, and I hope that this has explained, if you didn't already know better than I did, what fat over lean means. I hope this has explained it well to you, and happy painting, and I will see you in day 6.
That's what you want to do.